Hey, I wanted to welcome everyone to today's talk. I'm very happy to introduce Sebastian Weg, who is a professor of intellectual history at the School of Advanced Studies in Social Science, l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and also an honorary professor at the University of Hong Kong. And then, I didn't realize this, but you were also the director of the French Center for Research on Contemporary China in Hong Kong from 2011 to 2015. Professor Weg is extremely prolific. I just learned that he wrote his first book in French, which alas, I did not read, but those of you who know French should. And it is on May 4th era fiction. And his current book, which will be just hot off the press, so I wanted to share with you the current book, Minjian, The Rise of China's Grassroots Intellectuals. It is Christine Dunbar from Columbia University Press here has 6 books for sale, $30 for a book, and it's a beautiful book, and it literally is hot off the press, and I think we're going to hear a little bit about the book today. And I think it's very indicative of Professor Weg's interests. He's very interested in intellectual and cultural history, the history of intellectuals in 20th century China. He's interested in May 4th and New Culture debates on politics, culture, and literature. Also issues of publications in the public sphere and the intellectual and cultural history of Hong Kong. So please welcome Professor Weg. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eugenia, for your kind introduction and your hospitality here. I'm really very, very pleased to be presenting this book here because this is actually the place where I, at the very beginning of this project, presented my ideas that led to this book for the first time. That was back almost 4 years ago. So kind of nice to be coming back to this location, and also really pleased, obviously, to see the book out. And I want to take the opportunity and thank Christine for all the great work that the press did on the manuscript. So today, I mean, of course, it's very frustrating to present a book like this in maybe half an hour or 45 minutes. But what I want to try to do is, rather than go into the kind of theoretical aspects of what is an intellectual and can we really talk about intellectuals and how is Chinese society structured and what are all the debates about that, rather than do that, I think I want to give you a sense of all the phenomena. So I'm not going to say people, because that's one of the things I want to move away with, not focusing only on personalities, but looking at publications, groups, networks, so all of these things that have appeared over the last 30 years in China, and give you a sense of what kind of sparked my interest in these new grassroots intellectuals. So okay, so no worries. Too far away. Well, let me just start. It doesn't really need the first slide.
There we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So one of the things I have to thank the press for is using this interesting title, which I would have never dared to propose, to put a Chinese word into the title of a book. Minjian, The Rise of China's Grassroots Intellectuals. So this idea of Minjian, of intellectuals among the people, literally speaking. So I sort of translate Minjian by grassroots, but of course Minjian is more complicated than grassroots. But part of the idea of the book was to use a term that comes from the discourse of the people who were actually being studied here. So not imposing a concept from the outside and sort of constructing something that's not directly articulated among their own discourse. So the context in which this idea of being Minjian intellectuals or Minjian activists, so it appears in many contexts, first appeared was the kind of post-Tiananmen critical reflection on the status of intellectuals and the contribution that intellectuals make to society. So, of course, you're all familiar with the kind of critiques that came out of the post-Tiananmen moment, the critique of radicalism, the critique of intellectuals' elitism, the fact that they were somehow disconnected from society, that was perhaps one of the reasons why the movement didn't achieve success. At the same time, intellectuals sort of moving away from the central role in society, many of them going into academia, deciding to devote more time to academic problems rather than to intervening in the public sphere. And of course, throughout the 1990s, with the marketization of China's economy and cultural sphere, also the rise of the kind of market intellectuals, media intellectuals, government experts, people starting to make a lot of money from their intellectual work. So this is what Minjian intellectuals are not. In about 2004, there was a controversy that many of you might remember about the issue of public intellectuals. So when the magazine Southern Window, Nanfeng Chuang, published a special issue on public intellectuals with an array of 60 public intellectuals that they had selected, of which 6 were already deceased at that time. And this sparked a kind of big debate with the People's Daily weighing in, and perhaps even a central document that was never revealed, but that was talked about, criticizing this notion of publicness. So saying that intellectuals could not be public because, of course, intellectuals are part of a class, so they can only be part of the working class rather than intervening without any class connection, right? At that time, public intellectual was a kind of positive word that maybe led to this idea of Minjian or was somehow connected with Minjian. But very quickly afterwards, the notion of public intellectual was very severely criticized in China. And so now, all of you know, the Gongzhi are seen as sort of sellouts, media intellectuals, people who just sell their knowledge for personal profit or speak out for their own personal interests, right? So this whole Gongzhi meme, which I sometimes translate by pub int in Orwellian English, it became something very negative. So generally, I'd say today there is a kind of negative view of intellectuals in Chinese society, but not of Minjian people. So Minjian is a way to sort of not be part of those negative public intellectuals. I do try to make an argument that these Minjian intellectuals are somehow different from the way that intellectuals have been studied in classic social science studies. So I won't go into the details, but they are neither exactly sort of Bourdieusian accumulators of social capital, nor are they Gramsci's organic intellectuals. They might resemble a little more what Zygmunt Bauman calls the interpreters rather than legislators, so the postmodern intellectuals. The ones they might resemble the most are Said's kind of intellectual amateurs. So Said has an argument about the intellectual as an amateur moving between countries, disciplines, never entirely committed to any sort of reified identity. So this might be somehow have some echo with us with the idea of Minjian, but I'm trying to make an argument that this is something a little bit different from the intellectuals that have been studied previously. So, what do I mean by Minjian? Well, they are neither the shidafu, the advising and dissenting literati of pre-modern China, nor the Leninist scholar officials studied by Timothy Cheek, nor are they the Universalist Enlightenment intellectuals of the 1980s. They don't indulge in these sweeping discourses about the society and the nation and so on. Rather, they always sort of connect their work and derive their own status from their work with vulnerable groups on the margins of society. So that's a very important aspect in their definition. So I try to define Minjian in 3 ways. So just from the way that this term is used in everyday discourse. So when you take a term from everyday discourse, the problem is that it's very vague. So a lot of people use Minjian in many ways that are not necessarily very rigorous. So I've identified three main semantic traits in this notion of Minjian. Usually people who refer to themselves as Minjian, they mean that they are usually either two of the three following things. So unofficial, as opposed to, of course, Min and Guan, they are not part of the state. Non-elite, so this is why I translate it as grassroots. Usually people, when they call themselves Minjian, they mean that they're not part of the kind of the high classes of society. And third, so this is a little more ambiguous, but generally self-funded. They're not working for the market in that sense. They are somehow third sector, so I'll come back to this. The important thing I want to underline is that Minjian is not an organized civil society. So that's why I use this word, because, of course, in the last 20 and 30 years, there's been a lot of skepticism about this idea of, is there a civil society in China? And I don't really want to rehash those debates, and I don't think that there's a very strong argument for the existence of a civil society in the sense that we usually use that concept. So Minjian is a kind of alternative to that idea. Another important thing that Minjian intellectuals do is that they move away from these endless elite discussions that I think we're all a little tired of, between the neoliberals and the new left and all these sometimes very arcane sort of infighting and various academic factions sort of struggling for power in various academic circles. So these people are not part of those circles. They're also much more diverse than those circles. So, of course, the argument is that there will be, it's hard to make an absolute argument. I'm not saying that all of these intellectuals are outside of academia, but they have those of them that are inside academia are often very marginal within academia, and they don't derive their legitimacy from their work in academia. So that's kind of the important thing. So, which leads to them also being much more diverse than the sort of elite intellectuals that have usually been studied. So I remember having this conversation with Timothy Cheek, who, when he wrote his book on the intellectual in 20th century China, said, well, I can't find any women. Predictably, in the Minjian world, of course, there are many women intellectuals and activists who played a very important role in the kind of discussions that emerged from the 1990s. And that's only one example. There are other sort of aspects of this diversity. Final point I want to make here in the introduction is that there is, I think, a historical argument to be made about these Minjian intellectuals, and I think Eugenia is also working on a project that may have some links with this idea. Referring to Li Xiaoti's work on the late Qing and early Republican era, there is this idea, there has been this idea of a kind of special connection between intellectuals and the people since the late Qing. In Mayforth times, intellectuals called to go to the people, right? 到民间去. So that was Minjian. But then Li Xiaoti very nicely sets out how very quickly the people became the masses, and actually the Minjian became the Minzhong. So once the masses were there in need of guidance from the intellectuals, then it was in fact the intellectuals, the elite intellectuals, and the party intellectuals who got to decide which forms of Minjian culture were legitimate or progressive and which ones were feudal and should be eliminated. So this kind of Minjian quality was very quickly obscured or forgotten. Okay, so this brings me to my tentative typology of Minjian intellectuals, just to give you an idea. So I define these Minjian intellectuals as specific in Foucault's sense, which means that they somehow have some type of specialized knowledge from which they derive their their status, their legitimacy to intervene in social debates. Qin Hui, who's a well-known academic but also active outside of academia, has made many calls to study problems rather than debate isms, which is, of course, a catchword going back to Hushi and Mayforth times. But so this is something that's very typical of these Minjian intellectuals. So one example that Qin Hui gives, which I think is very evocative, is he calls that to, rather than endlessly rehashing this discussion of the market versus the state, which is the debate between the liberals and the new left, Qin Hui argues that it's necessary to both critique oligarchy from a liberal standpoint and populism from a social democratic standpoint, right? So he's saying that both of these notions need to be considered critically. So this is part of his larger argument that China has neither the social protections associated with a strong state nor the freedoms associated with a strong market. So rather it has the drawbacks of both and the advantages of neither. So this is very typical of this kind of positioning. Rather than defending a doctrine or a kind of ideology, look at problems more precisely and use specialized knowledge. So this is also, in Foucault's sense, the sign that specialization doesn't lead only to experts working in government think tanks, but also that specialized knowledge can actually play a kind of emancipating role, or can ground the autonomy of intellectuals. That it doesn't mean, specialized knowledge doesn't always mean that you're serving the state or you're serving the market, but it can be a tool to sort of stand outside of these various interests and take a different kind of position. So the second point, I already mentioned the connection with the grassroots and the margins. These Minjian intellectuals are subaltern. One of their very important concerns is with what was called the 弱势群体, the vulnerable groups, vulnerable, dominated, subaltern, so many translations. Subaltern was also retranslated in other ways, but generally speaking, I think I'm okay with translating 弱势群体 as subaltern. Disenfranchised, I think, is also quite good for 弱势群体. And part of the argument is that these are actually the people who suffered the most under the Mao era, so I will come back to this, but one of the aspects of being Minjian is that you don't sort of position yourself as an intellectual who was wronged under Mao and now are coming back to justify your position in society, but rather try to see how society as a whole went through the Mao and the reforms eras. Third point, intervening through public text. So this is quite straightforward. In the context of the relative pluralization of the public sphere in the 90s and 2000 through the marketization of press and publishing, these Minjian intellectuals had new opportunities to actually publish certain texts, speak out via certain media, whether over the internet or social media or in journals or in underground or semi-official publications, so all these things sort of came together at that time. And finally, they are third sector, as I was saying, neither state nor market. They keep an equal distance from both. They're neither government-connected experts, nor are they really dissidents who are sort of the shadow version of the government experts, nor are they media intellectuals. They are more people who try to find ways to rely neither on the state nor on the market. So that can be quite challenging in contemporary China, as you all know. So some of them are citizen journalists, some of them are artists living in migrant worker villages, some of them are NGO activists. All this means that their activities, their expenses must be kept to a minimum, and they try to find other sort of sources of financing. So yeah, the methodology part maybe is not so important. I can move through this very quickly. I do try to make a case for a kind of intellectual history approach of these people, or humanities approach. So I'm not a sociologist. I don't do interviews, or I don't look at them as a kind of social group situated in social structures. What I'm looking at is how they define their own activities, how they justify their own status based on public texts. And what I'm really interested in here is how the production of social knowledge works. So my object here is a set of discourses on society rather than society itself, although society also appears. But these discourses somehow seek to achieve a kind of form of social validation, right? So these are discourses about various aspects of society, about the past, about the structure of society today, about citizen rights, and these discourses are all discourses that originate from outside the state. And so that's not a normal place where knowledge originates from in China today. So these discourses need to go through some process of social production and validation. So that's what I'm really interested in looking at these people. And I think I probably won't have time to really go into detail, but I think that this set of discourses in some way constitutes a coherent whole that questions this kind of monistic aspect of the production of knowledge in China from Confucian and through communist times. So, I mean, many illustrious predecessors have pointed out this issue of monism, starting from Levinson. But many of these kind of aspects of Chinese intellectual production or characteristics of China's intellectual world or academic world, the predominance of this kind of Darwinist consensus or of teleology as a mode of thinking, many of these aspects are challenged by these people who are sort of subaltern and outside the system. So in a way, I see them as rebuilding some kind of knowledge outside institutions. Rebuilding, of course, after, in some ways, after the Maoist years and even after the reform years, which didn't really fundamentally question those assumptions. Okay, so this was the hard part. Now comes the fun part. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of these groups or networks or publications. The book is organized chronologically, so each chapter starts with a specific event which kind of marks some new dimension of these grassroots intellectuals and their production. So I start with Wang Xiaobo's book, The Golden Age, published in 1992. Of course, it was a very interesting book in its own right, but the reason why I start there is because it was such a success that it allowed Wang Xiaobo to leave his job in academia and become a freelance writer. So this was the first example of a freelance writer since 1949, basically. I'm sure someone in the audience has a counterexample. That usually happens, but I mean, generally speaking, I think that argument is still valid. So Wang Xiaobo was also a very special kind of character. Not only because he became, well, I mean, the fact that he resigned his academic job in 1992 at a time when it was certainly not fashionable to do so in China definitely points to as he defined himself, a 特立独行, right? But a kind of special person. But he also had a very specific personal history. So, of course, there's all his background during the Cultural Revolution, which he writes about in his fiction. But there's also his kind of symbiotic couple, intellectual couple with his wife Li Yinhe. So the two of them are somehow, I would say, at the root of these kind of Minjian intellectuals or their appearance. So Li Yinhe, I'm sure most of you here are familiar with her, is a sociologist now retired from the Academy of Social Sciences. And Wang Xiaobo and Li Yinhe in 1992, the year when Wang Xiaobo left Renmin University, published a study of Chinese homosexuals, 他们的世界. So this was, of course, a big thing at the time. Li Yinhe remains an indefatigable advocate for same-sex marriage in China's parliament, which is, of course, not likely to meet with success anytime soon. But so this is just to kind of situate the intellectual background. Wang Xiaobo was also very interested in all of these issues, this kind of sociological approach, so-called marginal groups, and in particular in redefining the notion of intellectuals. So the one thing that should be mentioned is his essay, 1996, The Silent Majority. So actually that was one of the titles I was thinking about for the book, and then it, predictably, this had happened even before it happened at the press. It had happened to me in talks that a couple of people who lived through the Nixon era said, you know, no way, you can't use that title. So altogether, I think it's much better this way. But Wang Xiaobo's Silent Majority, of course, is not Nixon's Silent Majority. But the argument of that essay is that society basically, well, there are many arguments in it. One of them is the kind of all-encompassing critique of Chinese intellectuals as these kind of moralizing, pontificating figures who always know what's right, who always tell people how to live their lives, and so on. So there's this anecdote about "Okay, let's pee," in which Wang Xiaobo says, you know, "Okay, let's pee" is not a... So, okay, I need to tell the whole story. So he attends an academic conference at which T-shirts are distributed saying, "Okay, let's pee." And Wang Xiaobo says, well, okay, this is very funny, but actually, okay, let's pee is not an appropriate injunction from an academic conference. Everyone needs to be able to decide when they would like to go and pee. So this is what he sees as the kind of Chinese intellectuals' way of regimenting people's lives. So basically, he advocates abandoning moralizing, embracing value neutrality. He talks about knowledge as a form of pleasure rather than as a tool of power or ideology. So one of his very, very famous essays is called The Pleasure of Thinking. He criticizes various kind of aspects that were sacred figures for intellectuals, like utopia, enlightenment. He connects enlightenment with the Cultural Revolution. He says, you know, if intellectuals always know better than everyone else what they should be doing, then basically that leads you to a situation like the Cultural Revolution. So this leads him to take the position of what he calls the disenfranchised, the 弱势群体. So this notion, well, I asked Li Yinhe about it, and she says that it was somehow derived from Spivak's notion of the subaltern. There's no real trace of that. I would probably hypothesize that it's more likely that it's somehow derived from these kind of Marxist theories about the dominated, perhaps through Gramsci. So you can see the 弱势者, you can find that in certain translations of Marx into Chinese. So it's interesting to kind of think about the theoretical position, because I do think that overall this is a kind of challenge to Marxist thinking, basically. Wang Xiaobo's view of society is a society in which everyone is part of a disenfranchised group. So that's the silent majority, is all of these disenfranchised groups. So there's no class structure, so of course this would be anathema to many of Wang Xiaobo's Marxist critics, and there's a whole series of them that appear throughout the chapters of the book. But I do think that this notion and its very productive afterlife marks a kind of shift in representations of society in China. So this these kind of foundational texts continue to inform many of the people who thought about their own position and wanted to challenge the previous position of intellectuals in China. So Wang Xiaobo, as you know, sadly died in 1997 of a heart attack very prematurely, so he didn't really take part in many of these debates. Li Yinhe did to some extent, but not very prominently in most of the sort of other aspects. She's focused a lot on her academic work, although she also continues to advocate certain political issues. So basically, moving on from this foundational moment, I look at 3 or 4 main areas. So as I said, knowledge about the past, knowledge about society today, and knowledge about citizenship and politics, and finally the public sphere, or the vectors through which this knowledge circulates and is validated. So the next stop on this ride through the 90s and 2000s is in May 1997, the 40th anniversary of the Anti-Rightist Movement. So that anniversary really marked the rise of a different type of history of the Mao era. So, of course, there were attempts earlier. There was an attempt in 1987 to mark the 30th anniversary of the Anti-Rightist Movement, but it never really gained the same kind of momentum. In the aftermath of this one, also because Deng Xiaoping had just died, there was a kind of moment of certain intellectual freedom. There were a whole series of publications and debates which gradually moved the discussion about the Mao era in a very new direction. So away from struggles between elites, away from this kind of view of Mao era history as being about different factions and elite factions and intellectuals being persecuted as one of those factions when they lost out, or as affiliated to one of those factions. Away from the exclusive focus on the Cultural Revolution, which was permitted within the scope of the 1981 resolution on certain problems in the history of the party. Away from the idea that Mao mainly targeted pre-1949 elites, and that therefore there was some kind of justification in Mao's policies. And finally, a rethinking of the role of intellectuals. So as Guo Yuhua, a well-known sociologist at Tsinghua University, writes in her book, basically the intellectuals were the prime drafters and participants in the kind of experiment of what she calls social gardening that took place under Mao. So the People's Communes, the Great Leap, all of these policies were drafted and carried out by intellectuals throughout the power structure. So, of course, I mean, there are different views of this, but it certainly won't do to simply say that intellectuals were victims and innocent victims and had no role in the tragedies of the Mao era. So these Minjian historians, who are they? Usually they're people outside academia. Sometimes they're academics who are not historians. Some are retired journalists. So this third sector aspect means that many of these people are actually retirees. Not all of them, but of course people who are retired have an income usually and can devote their, in China, I mean, of course not everyone, but many people do have an income and can devote their energies to these kind of pursuits. Many of them used material that was not previously used by official historians of the Mao era, in particular oral history. So a lot of people started going out to talk to people who'd lived through the Mao era, people in their villages, people from their families, trying to find out what they had actually been up to during the famine, during the anti-rightist campaign, and so on. Another whole series of methods were related to these lazi ziliao, the garbology, right, the study of documents that didn't come through official channels, things that work units threw out on the streets. So this basically is this idea of Minjian history. I can go into more detail. Maybe just one example. Some of you might know the Lin Zhao's story. So Lin Zhao was a rightist, a young woman who was a rightist at Peking University in 1957, and she was involved in a journal called Xinhuo, or Spark. So Spark was a journal that published just 2 issues in 1959 and 1960, and it was run by a group of people, some of whom were academics, some of whom were local cadres in Gansu, in Lanzhou. And one of these people, called Tan Chanxue, she published her memoirs in 2010. in which she was able to find the full text of these two issues that had been lost for many years. So actually this journal, in which Lin Zhao was also involved, I just mentioned Lin Zhao because she's more well known than these other people. So Lin Zhao contributed a poem to each of these issues. But these journals are basically full of articles which are extremely critical of the Great Leap Forward policies. So written as early as 1959, you have these very, very grassroots people in Gansu who are actually very clear about the problems of China's agricultural policy. So one of the articles, for example, reads, "The revolution was victorious, and what did we bring the peasants? Starvation and death." So this is really quite it's really quite remarkable, basically excavating these texts. Yeah, I don't really have time to go into much detail, but many of these texts circulated in semi-official or unofficial journals. In particular, journals like Ji Yi is still published by a retired film scholar called Wu Di, who basically makes PDF documents. So he receives, what's amazing is not that he's able to make PDF documents and send them around by email, thus escaping the censorship system. What's amazing is that he receives hundreds of manuscripts every month for publication in this journal, which has no official existence. So at one point he was publishing on a monthly basis. He had to move to a fortnightly basis because he had so many manuscripts. So everyone wants to write about their experience or their family members' experience or various aspects of the history of the Mao era. Okay. Let me move on the issue of independent film. So independent documentary, I would argue, fits into this picture as a form of investigation of society, an ethnographic investigation of society that doesn't have to go through the theoretical and institutional categories through which investigation of society usually happens in academia. So a lot of people got interested in understanding or trying to investigate Chinese society in a different way. So it just so happens that at that time these technical tools, DV cameras and other digital technology offered the opportunity for a lot of people to become amateur ethnographers. So just like the amateur historians, these people started making films about topics that were generally not accepted to be topics worthy of this kind of, certainly not artistic, but even not in general any kind of cultural production. So you're probably familiar with Jia Zhangke, so I actually don't think he's the best example of this kind of production, but I've put him here because people know him, and this quote is actually very revealing. He, in an interview with the journal Jintian, he defined himself as a Minjian director from the grassroots of Chinese society. 来自基层的中国基层的民间导演. So even in Jia Zhangke's cinema, you can still see some aspects of this documentary aesthetic, so the use of amateur actors, the use of local language, individual stories that are not representative of anything, no sense of responsibility towards society. So these are all things that are shared quite widely. But I think the more interesting ones are, or the more, let's say, the more relevant ones for the argument I'm trying to make are many of these sort of unknown documentaries. So one of them, another female director, Ji Dan, who made films mainly about migrant workers, people living on the sort of margins of urban sprawls and shanty towns, had a very famous controversy with a bunch of film critics at one of these festivals, in which Lu Xinyu, who's a kind of new left critic, was trying to argue that these new documentaries were in fact a kind of new form of realism that was pretty much comparable to critical realism that emerged in the Marxist aesthetics of the 1920s and 1930s. And so Ji Dan and some other people wrote a very strong rebuttal to that by referring to their work as a form of shamanism. So they say, we we don't speak for people. We don't take responsibility for people. We're just a mouthpiece through which these people actually get to speak. So that's a very different way of kind of defining their own position. So as a kind of cognitive approach, I think Minjian documentary is remarkable because it rejects these tenets of the realist aesthetic, so something representative, working with, selecting material that's representative of a problem, often presenting history in a teleological way, in a way that's oriented towards some historical outcome, and looking at phenomena in terms of class or social groups. So all these things are rejected in Minjian cinema, Minjian documentary. So it's always looking at things that don't seem to make sense, phenomena in their kind of very unfiltered textuality, time as contingent, and characters as individuals. So, our friend Ying, who is not here today, but she also Ying Qian wrote a very, I think, very important article on the independent film movement. So she concludes, for example, that this movement sought to break the state's monopoly on the interpretation of the social world and return that right to ordinary people. So this, I think, is very, very germane to this argument. And of course, they, again, are neither part of state institutions, nor are they part of the commercial circuit. They're anchored in marginal spaces where these documentarists or ethnographers share a living space with the people they are filming, artist villages or Chengzhongcun like Songzhuang in the west of Beijing or others. And they've developed their own way of understanding society outside of the kind of conventions of academia. So the third chapter is the one that's sparked off by Soonja Gong's death on March 20th, 2003. I'm sure you all remember the Soonja Gong affair. So Soonja Gong was a graduate of an art school, a design school in Guangzhou, and he was found dead in a custody and repatriation center. So the custody and repatriation system was notorious. I'm sure Jim here would have a lot to say about it. But no one had ever officially challenged it before this event. So this event was picked up by the commercial media, in particular Southern Metropolis Daily. And what happened was that three young legal scholars, who went on to become, at least two of them went on to become quite famous, Teng Biao and Su Zhiyong, wrote a letter to the National People's Congress. And although this letter was not in full-fledged challenge to the constitutionality of the custody and repatriation system, it did point out some inconsistencies between the law and the Constitution. And it was not, it didn't receive any official response, but the custody and repatriation system was pretty much scrapped, or at least deeply reformed, and its name was changed. So this was a new approach in using the letter of the law to challenge the system and advance a certain agenda to liberalize aspects of society. So again, the argument here is about how a form of specific knowledge, legal knowledge in this case, didn't only lead to professionals working for the state or working for their own interest, but also led to a form of legal activism, which was also at that time in great demand, with the rise of expropriations, labor conflicts, various forms of discrimination. So there was, of course, also a social need for this kind of activism. So the Weizran movement, which emerged from this Soonja Gong affair, covered a broad range of social issues. And here I also want to mention Ai Xiaoming and the Huangjing rape case, which took place pretty much at the same time as the Soonja Gong case. So this was Ai Xiaoming's first very prominent kind of intervention as a sort of public intellectual, although she vehemently rejects that notion, but this was also a kind of important milestone in feminist activism. So Teng Biao, for example, writes, who in the meantime has left China, Teng Biao writes that in the 1980s it was difficult to tie the issue of human rights to everyday life. And even in the 1989 demonstrations, many people felt that issues like human rights or certain freedoms were quite abstract or unrelated to their everyday lives. So by contrast, in the 1990s, many of these rights lawyers became very good at tying these larger abstract issues to many narratives of ordinary injustices and problems that people encountered in their everyday lives. So Wei Chuan, this idea of rights protection, was a concrete and non-confrontational approach to some extent, which tried to focus on the needs and the claims of these vulnerable groups, these marginal groups. So again, the migrant worker children, petitioners, various people who encountered forms of discrimination, and so on. Teng Biao, for example, points out that, ironically, the socialist state never really showed any interest in these vulnerable groups. Again, this is an area in which this kind of neoliberal, new left dichotomy doesn't really work. It's not that you could say that, the Chinese state has been actually protecting these vulnerable groups by virtue of its socialist legacy. On the contrary, these people have been left out of the kind of Chinese system. So hence the need for this kind of new type of social activism. So Gong Gong, the Open Constitution Initiative, defined itself as a new type of Minjian think tank. Unlike the salons of the 1980s, it was socially very diverse. It included a lot of petitioners. It was oriented toward concrete outcomes. It provided legal support to people. Su Zhiyong went to live in the Beijing petitioner village for several months. Su Zhiyong himself, who was the driving force behind Gongmeng, didn't engage as a kind of organic intellectual with a theoretical agenda, nor as a detached scholar, but rather as someone who was trying to find concrete solutions, practical solutions to practical problems. So this led him, for example, to not sign Charter 08, which he saw as being too kind of, so officially he said he wanted to protect Gongmeng, that's why he didn't sign it, but at the same time he did say in certain interviews that he saw this as too kind of abstract, unrelated to the real issues that people were interested in their everyday lives. So Gongmeng focused on the petition system, on black jails, on the issue of Tibet. They argued for the ability of professional research to propose solutions. And of course, eventually they were closed down. So Su Zhiyong's final statement to court before he was sentenced to 4 years in prison was, "We will not give up our promise to the vulnerable, to the 弱势群体." So this connection is really very clear. And the other person who needs to be mentioned here in connection with petitioners is Yu who's a sociologist connected to the Academy of Social Sciences, who's also been a very active force involved in the reforming the petitioner system. So Yu Jianrong is a kind of typical Minjian intellectual in the sense that he studied law, and then he made a fortune in real estate law in Hainan, which made him completely independent in some ways of his state employment. So he says basically, caste can do to me whatever they want. I don't need them. If they fire me tomorrow, then I'll just keep doing my own work. So this is how I mean that even certain people in academia can be considered as Minjian intellectuals in that sense. So he wrote a text, for example, which is called 我的底层立场, my subaltern standpoint, I translated, in which he argues that we need to see social problems from what he calls this subaltern standpoint, or the 底层 standpoint, which is different from the working class standpoint. So there was an interesting controversy. Pungai and some other people criticized him very severely for breaking with the kind of orthodox Marxist approach to the working class, and basically he replied to Pungai saying that he didn't share the view that the party was in a position to sort of continue to define or take such a leading role in defining the working class or prescribing their kind of needs. Yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail. I think let me move on to the last chapter, which is the issue of the public sphere and the publics that appeared, in particular with the rise of social media, with the commercial media, the commercial newspapers that appeared in the 90s and 2000s. So I tried to look at a couple of very prominent kind of citizen journalists, bloggers, people who were talked about a lot during this time. And I try to look at whether we can consider them as Minjian. So again, this issue of social positioning, the elite, how to connect with the 弱势群体, the disenfranchised, is a very central aspect of their discussions and their public texts. So I date the kind of beginning of this explosion of the media sphere to the Lhasa protests in March 2008. This sparked a huge debate on the Chinese internet. There could be other cases for other dates, but certainly this sparked a huge discussion about double standards was the main focus of this discussion, whether Western media and Chinese media were being held to the same standards in their reporting of the Lhasa protests. So Chang Ping, who is a very famous columnist, also now outside of China, wrote a column for FT Chinese in which he criticized the kind of nationalist activists and asked whether they were prepared to apply the same critical lens to the Chinese media as they were applying to the foreign media, who had made some mistakes. Remember, this is the anti-CNN group, right, in reporting on the Lhasa protests. So one of the aspects of their Minjian activism is their professional ethos. These people are very committed to journalism as a form of ethos that's not defined by the state or by the market. You can find similar examples in Han Han's blog posts from that time about nationalism, in which he criticizes what he calls the Chinese nationalists. So what's interesting in Han Han's writings is that he has a kind of ambiguous position. I would say he's not an entirely Minjian person. So he has this kind of middle brow or low brow. He presents himself as a very ordinary person. So remember, he's a high school dropout. He's not considered an intellectual by Chinese standards. He's looked down upon by the kind of cultural elite. He's not the kind of person who would be seen as legitimate to intervene in public debates in previous, certainly not in the late Qing or in the early Republican era, and even in the 1980s. So he gets a lot of this kind of very violent pushback from people who say, he knows nothing, he's just an ignorant high school dropout, and how can he justify his arguments? So on the one hand, he presents himself as an ordinary person making these ordinary arguments. On the other hand, he also tends to take this kind of elitist position, especially when he talks about the Chinese nationalists, and he criticizes in particular their lack of knowledge, their lack of understanding of the contradictions in their own discourse. In the 3 essays he wrote on democracy and freedom that were widely circulated at the time, these contradictions also come out very clearly. So he both kind of criticizes the people for their moral shortcomings and the elites for not listening to the people. So he can both deflate the grand discourses and ultimately still defend public intellectuals. And Su Zhiyuan shows many of the similar contradictions. I don't think I have to go into more detail. So let me move to the conclusion. Is that?
That's about right, yeah.
So just a couple of words to recap the argument. So as I said, Minjian intellectuals are people who mobilize specific knowledge to defend or articulate their subaltern identification. They endeavor to pluralize public forums, and they take a critical attitude towards both the state and the market. They challenged the state-dependent model of the universal intellectual that was so prominent in the 1980s by framing their interventions as those of ordinary citizens. In doing so, they also challenged the avant-garde role of intellectuals in the Marxist approach that the Chinese government continues to defend. They opened up new intellectual spaces and networks like unofficial journals, bookstores, artist villages, social media, and they have also kind of changed the understanding of who an intellectual is. As I said, a high school dropout like Han Han can now opine on some of the great political debates of the day. So intellectuals are no longer people who necessarily have a higher education, a stable position. They are no longer necessarily men. They look at different aspects or different groups within society, so that's what I wanted to say about that. So final point there, the reconstruction of social knowledge. So Minjian is associated with a series of terms like the silent majority, speaking out, the grassroots, the subaltern. This is this kind of galaxy, but as I said, not an articulated civil society. Citizenship to some extent remains conditional. What this silent majority shares is a sense of disenfranchisement. So with respect to the dominant Marxist representations of society, what determines the position of these groups is not so much class lines, but polarization between vested interest and a mosaic of disenfranchised groups with divergent agendas. So this determines this kind of pluralistic positioning of the Minjian standpoint. Minjian doesn't sort of propose a single body of knowledge. It argues to individualize and pluralize the construction of knowledge. So as Wang Xiaobo said, there's a need to separate cognitive and normative issues. Their knowledge, the knowledge that these Minjian intellectuals produce doesn't translate readily into prestige or authority. Many of them reject the notion of responsibility. So they're neither proponents of revolution nor really mouthpieces for different interest groups, but they are a force for continuing to pluralize discourses and modes of understanding society. So, of course, the thing I didn't talk about is that these people have come under incredible pressure in the last 2 or 3 years. So as I was writing, almost at the end of every chapter, you have a kind of 3-paragraph part saying, well, basically, these people have been repressed and punished and so on. But nonetheless, I think that the argument still holds that the marginalization to some extent of traditional academia may still be conducive to a more diverse formation of knowledge, which also ties into worldwide, I think, trends towards advancing citizen knowledge and rethinking the relation between academia and the grassroots. So I will stop there, and thank you for your patience.
Okay, so I think in the last half hour, we traditionally open the floor up for questions. So for Professor Weg and this extremely rich talk and book on Minjian. So perhaps we can field some questions. Okay, yes.
I'm just curious, like based on conclusion, specifically talking about how citizenship is conditional, also given that the major feature shared by the silent majority is disenfranchised. And then given your last point about how, especially after like Chairman Xi stepped into the power, how entire like NGO civil space such a shrink space. And I'm just wondering your opinion on what do you think about this grassroots intellectuals, their influence and the implication they can have on the society, and to what extent or what to magnitude they can have nowadays, specifically in current society?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, the answer is somehow in the title. Everyone is Minjian and no one is Minjian, right? So I think they can have a very considerable influence. I mean, if you look at Han's posts or certain of the more influential among these people were really very widely read. On the other hand, they are not a political force in any way. So their influence is very limited. Their influence is limited to, raising awareness about different ways of viewing society, making people aware that there are different ways in which you can see the situation of China today. So, I mean, in that sense, I'm still somehow confident that Chinese society continues to diversify, despite the crackdown, and the crackdown on information generates frustration and more interest in knowing things that are being denied. So, of course, in the short term, it can be quite effective, right? We all have examples of that. But I would argue that there is a kind of longer term dynamics towards pluralization. I mean, I taught a course this semester on 1989 on the democracy movement. No, I don't mean this in a negative way about the kind of intellectuals behind the democracy movement, but you can't help but being struck by the kind of what I call monism, right? I mean, by the conformity of Chinese academia in the 1980s. Even some of these people who were really lionized later on, I mean, many of them have a kind of understanding of knowledge which is really very strongly determined by this idea that there's one truth, there's one sense of history. They might not agree with the CCP's sense of history, but so I think that kind of mindset is being challenged. But probably you know better than I do.
Yes, in the back.
Thanks for the great talk. I have two questions. The first one is short. I was wondering whether or not these Minjian intellectuals or activists deliberately try to fight against the official discourse, especially the Chinese officials try very hard to impose or brainwash Chinese people, such as impose nationalism or some other discourse on people. The second question is that as some people, including Minjian intellectuals like Teng Biao put it, one way to advance civil society movement in China is organization without organization, and 无组织的组织化. So I was wondering to what extent or in what sense Minjian in your research is different from civil society in China, or is it a new form of civil society, or to what extent or in what way it is connected or interplaying with civil society?
Remind me of the first question, sorry.
Well, these Minjian intellectuals, do they deliberately fight against?
Right. The state discourse, yeah. So I think, many of them, of course, the idea is that many of them situate themselves outside of the state discourse. They don't, so some of them, Han is an example of someone who basically made his living by mocking official discourse, right, very effectively, by sort of holding up its inconsistencies, pointing out why it didn't make sense. The famous stuff about we need to defend the land we own and so on. And Han says, who owns any land in this country, right? When talking about the Diaoyu Senkaku or whatever, So pointing out the contradictions and the inconsistencies. But part of it has also been about avoiding direct confrontation with state discourse. So that's very clear in the Weizran movement. We're not going to, so the people who didn't sign Charter 08, like Qin Hui, like Su Zhiyong, saying, we don't need to engage in these endless discussions about, do we want to reform the Constitution, what is democracy, and so on. We need to do things that are more relevant to ordinary people and to articulate those things in ways that will connect with the larger issues. So that's also a way of sidestepping, I think, that confrontation. Civil society, as I said, I mean, civil society is not a term that's widely used by these people apart from the lawyers. So the lawyers use civil society, and the Teng Biao's, so that's Clay Shirky, right? The organization without organization. He takes that from Clay Shirky. I think even in the West now, there's a lot of skepticism about the ability of the internet and social media to really bring about this kind of organization without organization, and we sort of understand better that this may not actually, social media may not translate seamlessly into civil society, right? It's not because people are clicking stuff and mediated through various algorithms that ensure that, you might be clicking certain things while other people might be clicking other things. All this doesn't translate into, what we generally understand as civil society. So that's, I too tried to sidestep this debate, which is endless about civil society. Does it exist? Has it ever existed? And so on. So Minjian, everyone agrees that this is a concept that has some kind of meaning in Chinese history and for actors in Chinese society today. So I think it's a more modest term. Its claims are not as sort of broad as the claims of civil society. So, I mean, a lot of the civil society literature is about, so when the state collapses, when revolution happens and so on, then civil society will step in and so on. So I think no one is really ready to make these kinds of claims about China today. So Minjian is a more way of not over-promising on what these people are actually doing.
I have a couple. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoy. I think this seems like a pretty comprehensive topology of the Minjian terrain, and also a compliment on the cover, on the book cover, because I think it's Qiu Zhijie's artwork, and I think that's so clever and smart. I have two questions. So first is that, can you maybe, I know the Minjian is pluralistic, but can you maybe historicize and maybe specify some of its grassroots loyalty, the root of its grassroots loyalty? Does that stem from the Mao era of allegiance to the masses, or where do you think it comes from to the extent that it has a level of grassroots loyalty? And the second question is its interaction with the West, because it seems to me a lot of the Minjian intellectuals sometimes gain traction by almost being famous in the West. Whereas, like Ai Weiwei is a perfect example, even though he's not really not exactly a Minjian artist, but like he has a lot of more Minjian artwork, like artworks that attacks the government or reveal the inhumanity of it, and then he really got famous by being very popular in the West. So how do they, or to what extent do the Minjian intellectuals mobilize the Western preference or ideology?
Thank you. Those are all very, very broad questions. Just a word about Qiu Zhijie. Yeah, that's unfortunately it can't quite be seen in the size in which it appears on the cover. But Qiu Zhijie's 6-scroll painting is an intellectual landscape of contemporary China. So you have Wang Xiaobo somewhere around here, and then you have liberalism and Minjian and all of this. So the idea in choosing this image was to give an idea of the plural aspect of the intellectual landscape in China. Although this kind of big dominant structure of the state is still here right in the middle, and then basically it starts out from some traditional ideologies over here, and then running through this kind of big Maoist state and towards these areas which are more pluralistic. So I invite you to all check it out online. You can click on it and make it much bigger and check out all the details. So Minjian, yes. so in the Mao era, to specifically address that question, Minjian is not a kind of good word. It's the masses that count in the Mao era. It's the Minzhong or the Cunzhong. So Minjian was actually used by people who tried to excavate other traditions from the Mao era. So Qianlicun is the main example. So Qianlicun and some other academics today have argued that there is a Minjian tradition, which is the non-state tradition, which runs through the Mao era. So Qianlicun has specifically talked about Minjian Sixiang Cunluo, thought tribes, Minjian thought tribes in the Mao era. So going back to the kind of literary societies of the 70s, like Xu Xiao and these kind of groups of reading groups in the early 70s after Lin Biao's death. These people met and sort of talked about things in private and so on. So I haven't gone into the details of this yet, but Qianlicun, I think, is writing a Minjian history of the People's Republic. So we'll see what that amounts to. And going back even further, again, I rely mainly on Li Xiaoti's work here, but it seems that the Minjian moment, and speaking for May 4th, which I'm more familiar with, the Minjian moment is really quite short. Very quickly, the Minjian needs to be organized by the avant-garde intellectuals. Then that's when, as he says, the Minjian becomes the Minzhong. So there's this kind of moment where Dao Minjian Qu, so we go to the Minjian and we learn from the Minjian, but then very quickly we're going to teach them stuff, right? So by the time you reach the early 20s, basically there's the folk, what's known as the folk movement, right? So the collecting folk literature, folk music. Zhou Zuoren was very closely involved in this. There were various journals, the journal Minyao, but when you reach according to what I've read, when you reach the early to mid 20s, you find some very interesting. So Mark McConaughey, you might have bumped into, has written a dissertation on this folk movement. So what he finds is that even among non-communist intellectuals, there's a kind of idea that you need to reorganize the Minjian. That, folk songs, they have some maybe erotic aspects or some, other aspects that need to be normalized, basically. So, right. So anyway, it's not an organized political concept at any point. It's a diffuse kind of social Western ideology. Yes, so the whole idea of using Minjian is to look at it from the other perspective. But of course, it's true that these people are all informed. Many of them read Western sources. They find Su Zhiyong is a very typical example. Of course, he says he took inspiration from ACLU to set up Gongmeng. So he has an interesting discussion about minority rights and majority rights, how that works in the US and in the Chinese context. And when you look precisely, actually, some of these people have very interesting thoughts that are not at all sort of mechanistic transposition of Western theories. So he says basically the ACLU was set up in connection with minority rights, whereas we in China, we're not at the stage where we're dealing with minority rights, but rather we need to think about majority rights. But then he says, but actually majority is also different minorities. So this is where you come back to this silent majority issue.
Okay. Harlan?
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I have a concern and a question. And my concern comes out of a certain understanding of the 80s onward and the sort of neoliberal turn. And a critique that is heard so often that I don't think I need to go into it in a lot of detail for you to know what I mean, about social fragmentation, political economic fragmentation, as being a produced condition of this period specifically. You hear this a lot with the new rural Reconstruction movement. One of the difficulties is precisely the social condition of fragmentation. And so with that in mind, then what I'm wondering is, to what extent is this pluralism this diversification of ideas and positions which actively forswear seeking to build any kind of institutional power, to what extent does that map perfectly onto the kind of neoliberal development and overarching political control that seems to be underway? And is there a critique of that amongst these intellectuals and thinkers, let's say, thinkers of the Minjian group that you look at?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that issue is more kind of part of the Zhuyi discussion than the Wenti discussion. I mean, it's not clear to me that the 1980s in China are a good example of neoliberalism. I mean, as I said, what these people tend to point out is that the state has never had any interest in looking at disenfranchised groups. I mean, paradoxically, if you want, there's no, of course you can say, okay, so basically, you know, Tang Biao, please stop working with these people who have been expropriated, who are being discriminated because they have HIV, AIDS, or hepatitis, or whatever, because, you know, they need to get really angry and rise up against the Chinese government and overthrow the state. But I'm not clear that that's a very that argument is very relevant to these people. You know, I think that's a little bit of a false dichotomy. That's what I would say. That's why I say it's more part of the Zhuyi than part of the Wenti. So it's the isms rather than the problems. So of course these issues are endlessly debated in Chinese academia, you know, neoliberalism and the New Left, but you know, I mean, as Tang Biao says, what has the New Left ever done for these people who suffer discriminations? Right? So I mean, that's a little unfair. There are people who have been labeled New Left who don't necessarily identify with that term, who have also been active in certain areas. But generally speaking, I mean, you can't say that social activism has been strongly rooted among the academics, the elite academics who describe themselves as the New Left, right? That would be
I agree. The New Left has been consistently, utterly disappointing on that count.
Well, disappointing if you have expectations from elite intellectuals to change society. But my point is that this is what's being questioned, right? That it's not, you know, people are no longer looking to elite academics to change society, right? But are rather trying to be shamans, right? To let other voices be heard through them.
I mean, one of the reasons I raise this question is precisely because this category of Minjian, and it's you yourself have phrased several times, the Dao Minjian kind of historical legacy is very much, it's situated within a history of trying to build a new state and trying to build new social formations. Now, this is a very diverse and complicated legacy, to be sure. There's much we could discuss, but people like Peng Pai come to mind as people who are trying to build a new agrarian Soviet as a means of, you know, constructing a new kind of, you know, social form. So then, because we're talking about Minjian in contemporary China, I just wonder if there's a kind of discussion about these kinds of paradoxes in that legacy.
Yeah, I mean, Minjian in the May 4th era, I would say, is not linked so much to building a new state as it's linked to building a new culture. I'm not sure that that Peng Pai or people like that would talk about Minjian. So, I mean, the folk movement is more about, you know, finding more egalitarian traditions in Chinese culture. I don't see where the state really comes in.
Well, okay, I don't want to.
We can continue.
Yes.
Thanks for this, Sebastian. Thinking about a couple of things you say toward the end and want to see whether they open up some other things. One is a certain note of despair when you raise the question of whether in fact this is all over. And if so, how do you reposition the whole book if, in fact, the iron fist has come down? And a kind of, one way of I'm trying to think about it is also where you're drawing the lines of the Minjian movement. What seems to me to be outside it, but maybe I'm just hearing it wrong, or maybe you just didn't talk about it so much today, is is the intellectuals and activists in and around the labor movement. So this runs from lawyers to workers who maybe were fired or joined the worker movement and so on. As I think about Minjian, this seems to me something that I would like to see central to it, but maybe when we take that, we're also up against the possibility that this also is now crushed and has no way forward under the present circumstances. So I'm struggling partly with the boundaries of your very wide-ranging set of categories.
Thanks, Mark. So is it all over? Well, as I said, I try to make an argument that this diversification of society continues its work despite the crackdown. So clearly, I mean, it has less space for expression than it did 10 years ago. But I also think it's very hard to put toothpaste back into the tube. So, once society starts evolving in this direction, it's very hard to tell people that no, there's only one truth, there's only one sense of history. So people adapt to the new incentives, but that doesn't mean that society is completely frozen, right? So that would be my answer. But I mean, I agree that there are some very, very grave concerns, in particular related to surveillance and the capacity it has to alter people's behavior and preferences, right? So that's a big issue, which I think we would be wrong to consider unrelated to our own societies. So of course the labor movement is included in the Minjian world. So I have a couple of examples. It's not sort of the most prominent because of the I'd say there's this. I mentioned the discussion between Yu Jianrong and Pun Ngai, so this is part of the issue. Part of the labor movement strategically refers to state discourse in ways that are not really compatible with my argument on the Minjian. Now, to what extent that's an expression of the labor activists' convictions or whether that is something strategic is very hard to determine. But there are not many people like Yu Jianrong who really say that, so Yu Jianrong wrote that in order for Chinese workers to be emancipated, they need to get rid of the Communist Party and the prescribed worker identity that's prescribed by the party. So Pun Ngai took extreme exception to this argument and said Yu Jianrong is naive and the sugar-coated bullets and so on. So I try to mention that debate. I don't have an answer. I'm not here to say you're a real Minjian. I give you the label, whereas you're not. So I just leave it at that kind of.
I have a question. I'm actually kind of building on two questions that have already been sort of raised about your genealogy of the notion of Minjian. And in response to Harlan and this woman, you kind of jump back to Li Xiaoti or the May 4th. And I think I'm going to push a little bit on, these kinds of redefinitions of kind of intellectuals who are not part of the state and are not part of the market. This goes back to the issues of Soviets and state building. Mao had a very radical notion of the intellectual, which was an intellectual who would go and speak on behalf of the masses, right? So a mass line argument. And so this sounds actually quite, I mean, do these Minjian ever kind of mobilize this particular discourse as they, separate themselves from academia, a state-run institution, and the market? So I'm going to go back to the genealogy question a little bit that I think is kind of lurking in these two questions.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting aspect, especially also on the strategic level. That I mean, you can refer to Mao and make a legitimate argument about the interests of the masses and so on, but precisely, I mean, most of these people don't want to be representatives. They don't want to. So Minjian is not the masses, right? So Minjian is not Minzhong or Chunzhong.
Right.
So it's what's left, I would say. It's the residue. When you've taken away, Western civil society, you've taken away the mass line. So what's left of society when you've taken away all those concepts that have somehow become tainted or suspicious, or so Minjian is a kind of minimal definition of a position that you can take. So, I mean, it's once you start to pay attention, it's amazing how pervasive it is in China. Everyone tells you, "Oh no, 我们是民间的." So then I started asking, so what exactly do you mean by 我们是民间的? So that's where these things start coming out. Where 我们不是大教授. So okay, or we're not part of an institution, or so the mass line, I mean, at most as a kind of resonance, I'd say, but not very actively.
Yes.
Okay, so I understand that they have this kind of shamanistic quality and just channeling people, and they're not proponents and so on. That's, I guess, what they claim to do.
Right.
But how successful are they actually at filtering out their own preconceived kind of agendas? And do you find that they're actually able to do that?
So what would be the counter argument? I mean, that they are advancing the interests of intellectuals as a group, or?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, of
Sure.
some Chinese handheld camera documentaries I've seen, and yes, I think some of them are definitely in the tradition that you mentioned, but some of them do seem to me to be imposing kind of an agenda on the people they're studying, that from just viewing those documentaries, it's obvious is not there. I don't know kind of how that sorts out, but it seems to me there is that kind of side of people who are claiming to actually be channeling people, but actually are doing something else.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. That's always a concern. We should always be critical of, even when people don't claim to be speaking for other people, we should still be critical and attentive. Maybe a good argument would be the amateur historians for this. I mean, yes, clearly some of them, while looking at personal history and so on, clearly some of them have very sort of overwhelming personal agendas in the form of a whole genealogy of family members who died through violence during the Mao era. So how do they, I mean, my question would be, how do they sort of hedge against that? I mean, most of them are eager to sort of put that out in public to show people where they are speaking from, including to some extent, I'd say, the documentary filmmakers or the sort of civil rights activists. I mean, Su Zhiyong, for example, one of the things he always talks about is how everything is transparent. He has nothing to hide. All his sources of income are public. He tries to minimize organizational costs, this kind of thing. So, I'd say that many of them are informed and attentive to these issues. Of course, yeah, I mean, you can always find examples where it falls short of our expectations, I'd say, yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we're running out of time. So if anyone has questions, maybe you can come and speak to him for a few more minutes after the talk. But let's thank Professor Veg for stimulating us.